On the night of the 17th of August 1943, somewhere over the darkened waters northwest of Guadalcanal, a formation of Japanese Betty bombers came in low and fast, flying without running lights, at an altitude designed to defeat the kind of visual tracking that American anti-aircraft crews had relied on since the beginning of the Pacific War. The Japanese air crews had flown this route before. They understood the geometry of night attack. They understood that darkness was a weapon, that distance and altitude and the simple absence of light reduced even the most experienced American gunner to something close to guessing. What no amount of pre-flight intelligence had told them was that the men waiting for them below were no longer guessing. The guns were already tracking them. The fire control system had locked on minutes before anyone on the ground could see a thing. This is the story of how that happened. It is the story of a technology that American engineers and military planners had spent the better part of 4 years turning from a laboratory curiosity into a weapons system so precise that Japanese air crews began reporting something they could not explain in any tactical framework they possessed. It is also the story of a Bell Telephone Laboratories mathematician, a Naval Research Laboratory physicist, a generation of young American enlisted men who were handed equipment that had no training manual yet written for it, who learned to use it anyway, in combat, while the planes were already in the air. What they did not have was any answer for what was waiting for them in the dark. The technical foundation had been laid years before the war began. Robert Morris Page, a physicist working at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, had demonstrated a working pulse radar system capable of detecting aircraft at range as early as April 1936. His system, refined over the following 3 years into the CXAM shipboard radar, had been installed aboard the carrier USS Yorktown and 7 other capital ships by the time the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941. The CXAM could tell an operator that aircraft were present and give a rough bearing. What it could not do, with any precision useful to a gunner, was tell him where exactly to point a gun in 3-dimensional space. The gap between detection and fire control was the problem that consumed the next phase of American radar development entirely. The solution arrived in pieces from several directions at once. The Western Electric Division of Bell Laboratories, working under a contract with the Army Signal Corps, developed what became the SCR-584, a centimetric radar system small enough to mount on a single trailer and precise enough to track a moving aircraft continuously and feed corrected coordinates directly into an electromechanical fire control computer. The computer in question was the M9 Director, designed by David Bigelow Parkinson and his colleagues at Bell Labs in a collaboration that had begun, improbably, with Parkinson dreaming of an anti-aircraft gun in 1940 and working backward from the dream to the mathematics. The M9 Director took the radar track from the SCR-584, applied ballistic corrections for shell travel time, wind, target velocity, and transmitted firing angles to the guns without requiring a human being to do the calculation. The guns moved. The shells went where the computer said. By the late summer of 1943, this system had been deployed to enough forward positions in the Pacific that Japanese night operations were beginning to encounter something that did not match their pre-war understanding of what American anti-aircraft fire could do. The standard doctrine of Japanese naval air attack had been developed against a specific threat model, one in which radar, if present, was a search and early warning tool rather than a precision fire control instrument. The doctrine was sound against the technology that had existed in 1940. It was not sound against the technology that existed in 1943. And the Japanese, through a combination of intelligence failures and a general underestimation of the pace of American technical development, were slow to understand that the threat model had changed. The numbers that accumulated across the second half of 1943 and through 1944 were striking. Anti-aircraft units equipped with the SCR-584 and M9 Director combination were achieving hit rates at night that exceeded what unassisted visual tracking had produced during daylight hours earlier in the war. A post-war analysis conducted by the Operations Research Group of the Office of Scientific Research and Development found that radar-directed anti-aircraft fire required an average of roughly 100 rounds per kill against aircraft flying without evasive action at medium altitude. compared to more than 2,500 rounds per kill for unassisted fire in similar conditions. The reduction was not marginal. It was a transformation in the fundamental arithmetic of air defense. It was happening at a moment when the Japanese were committing their remaining experienced air crews to a series of offensive campaigns they could not afford to lose. What made the situation stranger for the Japanese was the apparent randomness of when the new accuracy appeared. Not every American installation had the equipment. Not every unit that had the equipment had yet trained its crews to the point where the system worked as designed. This meant that Japanese night attacks against some targets proceeded with tolerable losses, while attacks against other targets, sometimes nearby, were met with fire that seemed to find them in conditions where fire should have been impossible. Japanese after-action reports from late 1943 and early 1944 contain repeated references to anti-aircraft fire described as abnormally accurate, to shells bursting at the correct altitude without visible spotting corrections, to the sense among surviving crews that the Americans could see in the dark. They were not wrong. The Americans could see in the dark. The radar was doing the seeing, the M9 director was doing the arithmetic, and the shells were doing the rest. The men operating the equipment were, for the most part, not engineers or scientists. They were draftees and volunteers from American towns and cities who had been handed a 6-week course in radar operation and fire control maintenance and shipped to forward areas where the equipment regularly broke down in tropical heat, where the salt air corroded components not designed for it, where Japanese air attacks sometimes arrived while the crew was still troubleshooting a malfunction from the previous night. The men who kept the systems running did so largely through improvisation, through correspondence with technicians at Bell Labs and Western Electric who responded to field reports with hand-drawn schematic corrections mailed in official Army envelopes, through a culture of informal knowledge transfer between units that the Army Signal Corps had not planned for but did not discourage. The Japanese did eventually adapt, in the way that any competent military organization adapts to a new threat once it has identified what the threat actually is. By mid-1944, Japanese air crews flying night missions against radar-defended positions were employing low-altitude approaches designed to reduce the radar cross-section, using terrain masking where available, varying their approach angles to complicate track acquisition. Some units experimented with radar countermeasures, including chaff dropped ahead of the formation, a technique the Germans had employed against British radar defenses over Europe, and which the Japanese had learned about through technical exchanges with their Axis partners. The adaptations degraded the effectiveness of the SCR-584 in specific tactical conditions without eliminating it. The underlying problem for Japanese planners was that by the time their doctrine had caught up with the technology had moved again. The Mark 56 gunfire control system, introduced into the Pacific Fleet in 1944, extended radar-directed fire control to the 5-inch naval guns aboard cruisers and destroyers. The same fire control logic that had been applied to land-based anti-aircraft guns was now following Japanese aircraft across the sky, from moving platforms at sea, tracking through swells and changes in the ship's own heading, delivering shells that arrived at the predicted intercept point with an accuracy that overwhelmed the Japanese assumption that surface fire at night was essentially suppressive rather than aimed. Destroyer captains who had spent the early war expending ammunition in visible profusion while Japanese aircraft flew through the bursts with reasonable confidence were now watching aircraft disappear from the radar screen at the moment of fire. Albert Lasker, the advertising executive who served on an unofficial advisory panel to the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance in 1944, asked a senior gunnery officer after a briefing on radar fire control results what the Japanese made of it. The officer, whose name does not appear in the surviving record, told him that captured Japanese aircrew interrogations, processed through Pacific Fleet intelligence, contained a recurring theme. The pilots who had survived radar-directed fire and returned to their bases were describing the American guns as firing with a kind of mechanical certainty that had no reference point in their experience of the war to that point. They had been trained against opponents who aimed with their eyes. They did not miss at the same rate that human gunners missed.